I always find it very beautiful. I'm always very proud of everyone who does this. And not just because my sister and my nephew's up here, but in general, I think it's a beautiful moment when we dedicate children, when we bless children, when we bless the families. And it just shows that like how intentional we are with our faith, and also how important it is for us to continue in faith and to leave behind not just an inheritance maybe of like physical inheritance, monetary inheritance, but to leave behind something that we can be remembered by. It's not just a ceremony, it's a commitment by the parents, by the church, and believe it or not, by each of us, to raise children in an environment where they see real faith lived out and somewhere they receive a spiritual inheritance. I remember, I don't know, the thing is, what we often remember about, let's say, our grandparents and some of our parents isn't necessarily the details of what they've said to us, but more often than not, we remember the moments that we had. We remember the moments. I remember not too long ago, I was at my grandpa's funeral, and I shared about how he used to make me peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And he made his own bread, and he sliced the bread himself, and he would always slice them about the average size of a brick. And so he'd take those two bricks and he'd put them together, and just a little bit of peanut butter and a little bit of jelly, and that's all I had. Those are the moments I remember. He said a million things to me, and half of I've forgotten, but that stands out. And that's the thing. The things that we do in life, more often than not, is what is remembered more than the things that we say. So we've been going through Matthew, okay? And we've been going through Matthew chapter 24, and we've been going through Jesus talking about the wise and the foolish bridesmaids. We've been going on about how Jesus talks about the parable of the talents and what to do with what's been given to you. When we talk about the responsibility that we hold as believers, and this last section that we're in, this last bit of his message is what we're going to focus on this morning, actually. So if you have your Bibles, I encourage you to open it up to Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. It says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then the righteous will answer him, saying, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me.' Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me.' And then they also will answer, saying, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you?' Then he will answer them, saying, 'Truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into the eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life.'" So, I read these verses, and these are a very somber set of verses, but they are, I think, more applicable than not to today's focus, today's service, to the idea of baby dedication, to the idea of blessing, to the idea of inheritance, to the idea of legacy. Because to see an environment where real faith is lived out. To be in a place where they can receive a spiritual inheritance requires effort on everyone's part. It requires dedication on everyone's part. Proverbs 22:6 talks about the fact that the children don't necessarily just receive by osmosis, but rather it says, train up a child in the way that he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Which requires an effort on the part of not necessarily just the parents, but everyone else who surrounds them in that community. The reality is that there are many awful things and that can and do influence our young people. Too often we don't take responsibility to live faithfully and actively in their lives, and we allow someone else to train them up. And this ending to Jesus' big final sermon leaves us with this question: what kind of faith are we living? You know, I want to explore this morning what it means to be the kind of people who reflect Christ for the next generation. Because faith is inherited through action and not words. So, just a little, maybe some preview, talk about what previously has been mentioned. Jesus has been promising, and even here he promises a return. And throughout this chapter, he does the same thing. And he talks about a glorious return, and not just a return as a master coming back for his servants, not just as a return of a bridegroom coming back for the bridal party. He also today, he mentions that he's going to come back as a king and as a judge. And he gathers up everyone on the completion of the Great Commission, the final days, and he begins to separate people. And the thing is, if you notice, he doesn't separate people by their titles. He doesn't separate people by their knowledge or their nationality. He separates them by their nature. And like a shepherd, it's written, he separates the sheep and the goats. In reading these verses, we always have to hold on to one fundamental truth, all right? And that is, salvation is by grace. Make no mistake, that is still the underlying factor here. But salvation by grace alone, but the transformation is evident in the relationships and the actions. The actions of people are merely a description of their nature. Because of their nature, the sheep on the right are blessed to inherit the kingdom, and the goats on the left are rejected and receive judgment. And Jesus begins to explain to us and to everyone listening the criteria for his kingdom is compassion in action. Sometimes we as believers often get caught up in the nuances of faith. How many of you have done that? How many of you are guilty of that? I've been guilty of that. The nuances of faith, where you're thinking more about if I'm believing the right things, and if I'm doing, is it pre-trib? Is it post-trib? What is it? How does grace work? Am I chosen by Jesus, or do I choose Jesus? And we get so caught up with some of these details that we lose sight of what Jesus calls us to be. Jesus' focus is on the least of these, even in the verses that we just read. Jesus does not shy away from identifying with the needy and the broken. He says, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was a stranger, naked, sick, in prison. He identifies with the people who have physical needs. And the spirit of this message is coming back full circle. When Jesus began his teaching, he began with his most famous sermon, and that was the Sermon on the Mount. And he identified all who were broken and poor. But he identified them, it was more of a spiritual identification then. He said, poor in spirit, those who are mourning, those who are meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And in those needs and in that brokenness, he revealed to them that their truth, their answers would be found in God. And here he goes over these list of needs, and he said the needs of his people here are to be answered by who? His righteous people. And the righteous, it says, responded with surprise. When did we see you? You know, that underlines this fact that their actions were so natural that they didn't realize they were serving Christ through serving one another. They weren't looking for credit in everything that they did. We talked about the Pharisees and the 7 woes, and that was all for the attention, all for the credit of others. And here we see that they're doing it out of a place of instinct. They weren't looking for credit. Their love was instinctual. The relationship with Jesus that we encourage, that we strive for, it does not end in our churches. It does not end in our private rooms where we contemplate, where we pray, where we meditate on the Word. It doesn't end when we clock into work. It doesn't show when we show up to school or when we're stuck in traffic. It transforms our very nature, how we see the world, and more importantly, how we interact with it. You know, James, the half-brother of Jesus, underlines this point in chapter 2, verse 18. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. The parents this morning, they're committing to love, to nurture, and raise their children in faith. And this isn't something that is done through osmosis. But this is done with intent and thoughtful action. This is why Jesus calls all of us to model love and action, not just for our neighbors, but for the next generation as well. This extends not just on a personal level of people that you encounter with, but it extends generationally as well. I'm reminded time and time again, unfortunately, the more I hang out with my nephews, the more time that I spend with family, that children copy everything that we do. And they barely listen to what you say. Hey, don't go over there, don't go over there. But then you get mad or something, and they're like, oh, just like you. You're like, what's this? Hey. It's exactly the truth. Children learn faith also by watching us. Younger believers learn faith by watching us. And are we showing what Jesus looks like? Can we, as believers, all of us here, profess like Paul did in 1 Corinthians 11:1, be imitators of me as I am of Christ? What we model is what is imitated. You know, the goats, what's interesting, again, in this set of verses, is the goats were not condemned for doing something evil. They were condemned for doing nothing. James 2:17 underlines this fact. So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. And that's the thing. These weren't dramatic failures of the goats. They weren't like, Jesus doesn't call them out for like denying him. He doesn't call them out for like doing some crazy sins or anything like that. No, their daily neglect and their greatest sin was the sin of omission. And once again, this does not mean we are saved by our works. But what it means is true faith produces action. It spurs us forward. It cannot be contained. It moves us. It is unrelenting. And it's not just the guilty feeling back there that makes you go, ooh, I should have done this. I should have said this. No, it is a gnawing for the healing of the world. It's a passion and a zeal for the heart of others, for the lives of others. It's a frustration with the way things are and the way things should be. It's a heart that is full of empathy and compassion that breaks for others and it breaks for the broken. Because it's so easy to become self-contained as believers. It's so easy to just hoorah ourselves up and to say we're doing great, keep fighting the good fight and doing nothing about it. I've been reading the biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he was a Lutheran pastor during World War II. And he died by hanging for being an outspoken opponent to the Fuhrer. He pastored during the time when most churches were nationalist supporters. They didn't stop their services. They didn't stop preaching. They just stayed silent in the face of evil. He has a famous quote that says, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." So the question again comes up, are we teaching our children? Are we teaching our community to love like Jesus? Or has our faith flatlined? Because what is required of us is a living and breathing faith. It requires active participation. Faith is not just talked about, but lived out. You know, right after the instruction that to children to honor your parents, your father and your mother, Paul writes in Ephesians 6:4, bring them up to parents. He says, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Underlining this fact, faith is not something that is inherited again, it is modeled. It is how it is passed down. And all believers, not just the parents, are called to be spiritual role models. We're all called to teach compassion. We're all called by serving others. We're all called to teach faithfulness by our commitment to Christ. We're called to teach integrity by practicing what we preach. That goes for me as well. Because oftentimes, I think we have this misconception about raising up the next generation, about maybe discipline and instruction. And we think what that means is to cut down everything that stands opposite. We think, okay, well, what we have to do is we have to remove all the bad books. What we have to do is we have to put our kids only in private school. What we have to do is we have to make sure that everyone just list up a whole bunch of rules. What we have to do is we have to wall the church up and the gates have guards on them and make sure that only the right people show up and we protect them in that way. But the reality is, more often than not, what we have to do is we just have to nurture faith. C.S. Lewis says the task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. We're not supposed to force belief onto the next generation. Rather, we have to water the soil for them to experience God personally. And that's the thing. It doesn't have to be a major, huge act. Question is, what can you do this week to reflect Jesus to those around you? There are simple acts that you can do. What small act of kindness can you do? Remember, faith is not just knowing about Jesus, but living like Jesus. Today, parents dedicate their children to the Lord. Each of us is called to dedicate ourselves daily to living out our faith. I believe that church should be more than just believing in Jesus. It should be like living like Jesus. And whether you're a parent, a grandparent, a member, young or old, I invite you to commit today to being the person whose faith is seen and not just spoken. Living life so all can see Jesus through you. I want us to spend a little bit of time in prayer. So I invite you to rise. And take some time to reflect maybe on areas of your life that have been just talk. Areas of your faith that have been just talk. Because in contemplating even these verses and in studying them and thinking about them for my life, I saw so many areas where I'm like, Lord, I didn't have the right heart for that situation. Instead of being compassionate, I was callous. Instead of showing love, I showed indifference. And maybe you need to rededicate yourself to your nature. Renew your mindset and realize that I have to live in a manner of compassion. I have to live with a life that extends a hand to fellow man, extends a hand to those who are hurting and those who are broken. Because that is our responsibility. Jesus says that he handles the spiritual and those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. He gives them their bread. He gives them their life-giving water. But when it comes to those who are actually hungry and those who are actually thirsty physically, he leaves that task up to us.